Great. Well, my name's Emma McElwright. I'm local town councillor for Radbrook and I'm the coordinator for the Shrewsbury Green Party. And I'm joined today by Cllr Shahin Ashraf and Cllr Julian Dean. Cllr Ashraf is a councillor in Solihull and Cllr Dean is our councillor in Porthill in Shrewsbury. They're both very involved with the Green Party, and Cllr Ashraf was the first Muslim mayor of Solihull. Cllr Dean is a senior political advisor to the Green Party, so we're really interested in their opinions on our questions today. And the first question references our title of the talk for today, talking about hate. And all evidence suggests that there is a rise in all kinds of divisiveness in our communities. How would you describe the way hate and division are affecting our communities at the moment, and why do you think this is on the rise?
Okay, thank you, Julian. So I think there's four things around hate. One of them is around economic and social pressure. The number two is the manipulative narratives that we see around the policies that are being shown around the different spaces, as well as the algorithms and social media that we're seeing, which are really seem to be popular or unpopular, whichever way you want to see it. And the fourth is that cultural and identity issues, I think. And I speak as a councillor from Solihull. I didn't live in Solihull all my life. I was brought up in a place that Robert Jenrick mentioned, which was Handsworth. And look, I grew up in Handsworth in the 80s, and there'll be a lot of stories from me because my thing is very much lived experience. So I grew up in the 80s, and back then in the UK, living in the shadows of a Conservative government in the 80s. We all knew those of us who were there, we saw high unemployment, we saw absolute poor housing and underfunded schools. That's what we saw. And that created some real pressure in the areas that we were in. And trust in institutions was very, very low at that time. And the tensions eventually boiled over into what we said, the infamous Handsworth riots, which opened up this this narrative of civil unrest and triggered by tensions between the police. The riots reflected deeper issues of what we faced as people, which was racial discrimination, which was unemployment, very high unemployment in those days, and social deprivation. So the combination of those three, and actually we were from working class communities who faced that racial injustice because we knew that our schooling would never get us the jobs that we wanted to do, would not allow us into various fields, even into the university. So that poverty and that lack of opportunity created that social tension. So just putting that into, as we're framing this conversation, because your question is, what drove hate and division? So when people like Zach, our leader, when people like Zach and his economic vision speaks truly to facing that whole fiscal rules, all these pressures that we see. For me, it's about him saying, I'm going to install a panel of experts in places like Handsworth, in places like Birmingham, in places like Solihull, in which, where we will have sustainable understanding of what is causing the problems in the first place around those economic pressures. So, when you see, as you see around the world, and I'll mention reform, for example, they are funded by billionaires. And these are people who understand bond markets really well. They understand the hoarding of wealth in this space. And that leads to a lack of cash incentives within our local work. For example, when I look at public services and I see children with special education needs who are neurodiverse, who are struggling to get onto the economic ladder, who are struggling to get jobs, who are classed as NEET, not in employment, education or training. For me, I think part of that narrative is, if you look at the picture, is not only my lived experience, but some of the stuff is around that drives that division and hate. So in Solihull, between the north of Solihull and the wealthier suburbs of Solihull, there's a 12 to 15 year life expectancy gap, just in a 5-mile radius. And it's horrific what you have to see when you see the inequality just in that space. Then you wonder why tensions rise in young white working class boys who are in the north and in the more affluent south. And so I go back to my story. My father couldn't afford the mortgage back then in the 80s. And so you're tackling at the end of it, I think one of the things that the drivers of hate and division is that you're tackling not hate and division, you're tackling inequality. That's what it's all about. You're having to tackle inequality, and that's what we should be talking about when it comes to hate and division. Because a lot of people look at me and say, well, it feels as though you're taking our jobs. Well, they're not your jobs. We've all worked hard. We've all got to this space where we are, and part of that is so. In answer to the question around division. It grows from economic insecurity, and it's a lack of trust and exclusion. And even the British Futures Report of 2023 captures that, and drivers of inequality are those. And it's unfairness, because when you see in the north of Solihull and the south of Solihull, it is complete unfairness. Why should one person in the north, we have HS2, which we spent billions on. And when you see policies in trying to get people in employment who are not in employment or training, who want to upskill themselves to go into the south of the borough. And then one of the economic policies that you have in the borough is actually, I don't want to pay £4.26 for a person from the north of the borough to travel to the south of the borough. That's more drain on the public purse in the long term, in the life cycle of an individual, than it is if you pay the £4.26 to be able to upskill people within our spaces, within a 5-mile radius. So division is amplified also by political leaders. And we've seen that. I was on LBC yesterday morning when they were talking about what is Eid and how do you celebrate Eid, and I thought, this is LBC. Eventually they're going to ask me something controversial, and the controversial thing was when Muslims prayed at Trafalgar Square, how did you feel about that narrative? And I said, look, that's not the thing that divides people. If he's the Shadow Justice Secretary, he should be thinking about how we're going to clear all the backlog in the courts. He should be thinking about how we're going to tackle the criminal system. If all he thinks is this is the problem, he really ought not to be the Justice Secretary. And those are the type of things, I think, that are creating the divide. In answer to your very short question, a very long answer, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point about the narrative being driven is just so important. I mean, I'd also, I'm not going to press you on it, but just I think for us in the room to understand the way that this has changed over the last couple of years is really important. Because if we just look at the statistics, it's quite clear that there's a real rise in hate crime. We've seen there's a guy going up in court in Shrewsbury in a couple of weeks for attacking the Muslim centre here. We know, and it's right across the board, isn't it? We've seen a huge spike in crime against transgender women, for example. From a situation 2015, there were 500-600 incidents. When a couple of years ago, it was reaching 5,000. So something has changed, and then you talked about the way that narrative is driven, and I think that's it's absolutely at the centre of it. And what's that all about? And I was had conversations with my partner about this. How do people get to a stage where they feel comfortable being violent, being abusive, and even you can think the example I was thinking about was even how does somebody like Trump get comfortable with bombing people? You have to dehumanize them. You have to reach a position where you do not see them as humans, or you do not see them as equal, and that dehumanizing thing. So we've got political leaders, if you like, the sort of the mainstream ones on the right, who won't quite do that. They won't quite do the dehumanizing bit, but they will nevertheless hint at it, and then they allow their outriders on the far right to really put the boot in, to really go with the dehumanizing stuff, to really sort of, insulting and to talk about people being animals and to, all that stuff, which is I think is absolutely crucial part of it. They have to dehumanize in order to then get away with that narrative. You also talked about, you sort of hinted at the white working class boy and that, and I think we do have to tackle that issue. Why is it that we're seeing something happen within those communities? And I think the first thing we have to say is it's not the whole of the white working class. The white working class is extremely varied, and in some places, if we're talking about inner city areas where communities are already mixed. Actually, I love the phrase that Hannah Spencer used during, I think she even used it in her speech. She said, we rub along. You know, it doesn't mean that we absolutely understand each other. It doesn't mean that we share everything, but we rub along. And that's fine, isn't it? That's, you know, to bring a word back which has gone out of favour, that's multiculturalism. That's what we're after. A word which I actually prefer to integration, because integration starts to sound a little bit like assimilation. You know, so that, I think that I've lost my train of thought now, but oh yeah, so the white working class. So you've got those areas. You've then got, I've just been reading a book by somebody called Joel Budd about the white working class. You've then got other areas, which are, if you like, what he calls heartland areas, but sort of older traditional white working class areas. And he identifies South Wales, and he identifies parts of the North East. And actually, again, these places are not heavily full of hate, because actually there's a very small ethnic minority population, and people know that they're getting a shit deal. It's not that, but it isn't driven in that way. It's in some of these places what he calls I forgot what he calls them, but the sort of, you know, the enclaves where you've got sort of, you know, white flight, those sorts of areas where it really seems to be at its worst. And the other thing, so there's the geographical thing, but there's also, I think, a thing in terms of age and in terms of all those other things. You know, one of the examples that he gives, I think, which is really good, is that, you know, your retired steel worker typically is probably now a Reform voter, and is probably anti-immigration, and probably voted for Brexit, and is motivated by those things. So that doesn't mean they're out there on the streets attacking asylum hotels, but they're on that wing. Your typical young working class woman in a precarious job in a city is not a racist. It's not, you know, it rubs along. So the working class, the white working class, is very varied, and it's varied because of the position that it finds itself in, which then, of course, takes us to what you said about all of that economic precarity. You know, the fact that people have lost trust, have lost faith in the system, and then, unfortunately, that then opens up the possibility that then allows scapegoating. But you can only do the scapegoating, you come back to the first point, you can only do the scapegoating successfully if you've dehumanised people in the first place. I think that's so crucial, and it starts to give some clues as to how we fight back, I think, which we'll come on to.
Thank you, yeah. So it's really interesting talking about inequality, and that people tend to look to leaders when they're in times of economic instability, and we're getting these messages from leaders that are not positive ones. So for us as leaders who want to give out a positive message, it feels like we have two jobs. To stand by and defend racialised, minoritised communities, and also to demonstrate to those not in the direct line the falseness of the attacks and the wider benefits of solidarity for everybody. Just for the first one, how can we stand by and defend those who are under attack as leaders? Yeah,
so I've been through this, and probably why Julian invited me. No, no, but this is the thing. And going back to your point, I worked on. When I first started off working as a humanitarian, I started off, my first piece of work was on Bosnia in 1992 to 1995. And the language that was used in Bosnia was the language that was used, exactly what Julian spoke about, was around dehumanization of the Muslim population. That didn't look any different from the rest of the population. It was language like blaha, they are cockroaches, and that language started, I mean, remember, this is 1984, that's where the Winter Olympic Games were held. By 1989, the narrative of hate and division started spewing out. By 1992 to 1995, there was a genocide of people that looked exactly the same. So the curtailing of hate narratives can lead to the dehumanization and leads to the dehumanization of people. And I think for me, hate in that space, and I'll answer your question, hate isn't random, it's a product of social anxiety and social isolation and narratives that misrepresent reality. And you know, you see people both in those conditions who have stories that need to be told. We commemorated last year Bosnia's 30 years of that genocide. 30 years, first time in European soil after World War II, and we said never again. We said never again. And here we were commemorating that very same narrative that you've spoken about, Julian, around that whole thing around dehumanizing people. And you see that, and for most of us who've followed the Gaza work, I mean, that's my work, my day-to-day job, but the same narrative around the dehumanization of language there, the dehumanization of language, where you can see that hatred beginning to build, that same narrative. It actually, if you have a look at it, the same narrative, the same playbook is read again and again when that narrative starts, which is really, 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 really difficult, because people think the perceptions of being left behind or losing something or losing benefits are explained by people who exploit that very narrative. When I became a counsellor on the back of anti-Muslim hatred. We had just come back from Geneva, come off a flight, and we managed to get, believe it or not, for the first time, managed to get humanitarian access to women and girls from an Afghanistan perspective at the UN. We were happy. Came back off a flight when one of my friends texted me, one of your local Conservative councillors said all Muslims go back home. I said, where does he want me to go? I've only just moved from Birmingham. And this is the thing. It was, well, what does that mean? Where do I go? Like, we were born and bred. We're second, third generation British. Where do we go? And so he said, well, I don't know where you go. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to stand right outside the council building, outside the council. And there I was, one woman protest. It was raining very badly. My Amazon signboard cracked into two, as it does, as a one-woman protest. And it was the Green Party that came up to me. It was Max that came up to me and said, have you ever thought about becoming a councillor? I said, well, I'm not very political. Technically, in my head, I wasn't very political, but in reality, I am. And it was one of those things where I thought, no, because I'm protesting against, people who are being othered. And about 4 months later, Max got in touch with me and he said, have you ever thought about becoming a councillor? And I said, no, I haven't thought about it. He said, look, I think you'd make a really great councillor. And just come and talk to us and we'll have a conversation. And we did. It was a conversation. And eventually, when I was elected in what is, to answer to your question, it was a very elderly ward, a very conservative ward. And after the amazing, brilliant campaign that the Green Party did at that time, I won 68% of the vote. Brilliant. And that's the thing, that's the change, right? And I think the problem was me being in a hijab, thinking I'll never get to this, because the first door I knocked, they said, no, Jehovah's Witness is there, love. And I said, oh, not Jehovah's Witness. Let me try and change that narrative. But the subsequent doors that I knocked were amazing. And, people like Hillary as well, just there, who's supported me throughout. I mean, like yourself, Julian, supported me throughout. Because sometimes it's a lonely place being in that space, especially by yourself, and you look different, and you kind of think to yourself, how are you going to do this? And I think this, when you ask me, is it a twofold responsibility? The fold of responsibility is people like Julian, people like Hillary, like others who will come out and support you. When I became mayor, I did a lot of cross-party work with the Conservatives, as you do, and it was the first time in probably 125 years of Solihull history that are most different in terms of colour was green, a mayor. The first green Muslim female mayor in Solihull. And that happened a lot with cross-party work, but the first person I got attacked by that very evening was Tommy Robinson. Oh, God. Yeah. I was in the papers, and it was all, we didn't elect her, look at her, this and the other. And the hate was unbearable. And I think it was the point where I thought to myself, you're either going to let this thing affect you, or you're going to do what the people elected you to do. But it does take a lot out of you as a human being to cast aside the hate and say, right, do what you're elected to do. and I did exactly what I was elected to do. So in answer to your question, standing by people who racialized minorities, that's a really good example. That not only did the Greens stand behind me on a national level, on a local level. I mean, Chris Williams, who reached out in the end, Chris Williams reached out and he said, I think that is an absolutely brilliant thing to do. And he was one of the people that supported me and door knocked on my behalf. And there is the other one that in which we're drawn to being attacked. And what do you do in that space? And I have to say, I traveled the length and breadth of the borough. It's 230,000 people in our borough in Solihull. And we had the Prime Minister visit us after Southport. I said, listen, mate, you know, the riots happened in Birmingham, not in Solihull, but he still wanted to visit Solihull. And then we had to host him. And it's a Conservative council, so, and it's a Labour Prime Minister. He did not they did not formally announce it to the council. So I was the conduit in between that ended up having to converse on this conversation in the end as an ambassador for the borough. And I think defending people in the borough, look, visibly I was the most different mayor that they've had. But I was also one of the only mayors that had gone out and delivered Christmas meals on Christmas Day. When they said, look, Madam Mayor, we've never had anybody work on Christmas Day, but we know that you're different and you're going to tell us something different and you're going to make us deliver meals on Christmas. I sat there with people who had probably fought actually one of the couples had fought in World War II. One of them had served in Burma, who said, this is the first time that a mayor's come in and supported us. And it's about actually bridging that divide, because at the end of the day, you're only as human as somebody perceives you to be, right? So it's about cutting across that. And that's basically, when in answer to your question around the twofold responsibility, yes, the responsibility is on me, but also the responsibility is on others to be able to help us to be in the environment so that people see us as one of them and not different.
Yeah, it's an amazing story as well that you said you felt that you were not very political, but you were standing up there with your sign and you were protesting, and it takes somebody else to sometimes see those qualities in you and say, no, you're really good at this, you know, and this is politics and that's what you're doing. So yeah, thank you for that.
But just to let you know, on the one side it was Save Our Council, on the other side was reinstate our glue sticks. Because the education thing was basically we'd run out of glue sticks in Solihull, and but that was the point. Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't think of it, but running out of glue sticks, also political. Yeah. Amazing, thank you. Councillor, anything you want to say about protecting?
I mean, it's both terrible and extraordinarily impressive that you had to put yourself in those positions and that you had to be the person. I mean, that idea that you're the bridge between, you know, a moribund Conservative council and a basically coward of a Labour leader coming into Solihull and not really wanting to engage properly, but you step up and do it. And I think it's hugely impressive, but it's what we have to do, you know. And I think there is something about the green politics which enables us to do that, but I think that business of standing up to the far right, to that narrative is the first part. You know, in terms of the answer to the question, you know, how do we stand with people? We just have to do it. We just have to be visible, and I think that has shifted slightly, hasn't it? Because I think I don't think there was a period where there wasn't a lot of this about, but occasionally, you know, the old BNP or something would get out and then the opposition would come out and shout Nazi scum and then everybody go home again. And I'm not sure that's not where we are anymore. You know, things have moved on. So you've got to be a little bit more canny. And I think part of that is about providing hope. I think, you know, to come on to that later, but just in terms of the solidarity thing. And then I think for us in Shrewsbury, just thinking it, you know, I think we do need to think it through absolutely solidly. And actually, before I go to Shrewsbury, I will mention Craven Arms because Hillary's here. So, you know, Hillary went out of your way in South Shropshire to reach out to the very small Muslim community that is in Craven Arms, because there's a halal abattoir there, which apparently produces some of the best lamb in Europe. But and you reached out to that community, and I'm assuming that link is still there, and you know, and that's appreciated. you know, because people are isolated. We delivered a card to the mosque here. I cycled one over there yesterday. Yeah, I've got no idea what the response will be, but you know, I just thought it was important, especially because of what happened in Trafalgar Square, to reach out. And then, you know, other things. You know, we Jamie tells me that the best coverage we've had locally was for actually standing up to the flags. You know, saying something, getting it in the press, making it clear that we recognise that for many people that is intimidatory, that is making them feel not wanted. You know, and so just making those statements is so important. And then we have to listen to people. We have to learn, you know, about what that experience is about, so that we're not just going through the motions, so that we are genuinely providing support. But then I also think that, you know, it's also a job for us, especially if you're elected, or you're even in workplaces actually, is to do our damnedest to fight the institutional gains that have been made. You know, and they're not huge. But where there are policies which are actually trying to make sure that the workforce is more inclusive, where there is, you know, we got slammed for producing multilingual leaflets in an election. Can you believe it? You know, if that had been in Wales, and there'd been, like, you know, Welsh and English, although Farage is apparently now saying that Welsh is a foreign language, even in Wales, but you know, that wouldn't have been an issue. So why is it that it's somehow an issue not to produce multilingual leaflets in Gorton and Denton? We got slammed for it, but you know, it worked. So you know, so defending those sort of institutional gains that people have made, you know, and it gets attacked, doesn't it? You know, for being PC or too woke or whatever it is. But it really matters, because it is about people. It's about, you know, it's about transgender people recognising that the toilets are actually for them as much as they are for anybody else. It's about you know, people of colour recognising that these jobs are just as much available to them, and that's why we're doing, you know, blind shortlisting without the name, because we know that if the name is there, if it's a black or Muslim sounding name, you're much less likely to get the job. So we have to defend those institutional gains as well.
And on top of that, for Muslim women, we're 8 times more likely not to get the job. We're just on research shows. Just coming back on your point, actually, Julian, if you don't mind, I remember. So we were in a very posh neighbourhood of Solihull, and this goes back to 1368, this neighbourhood does. And we were going through, so I was obviously mayor with all the charms, walking through, and she said, "Madam Mayor, I've been tasked with your, to take you around this fete." And I said, "Oh, how lovely." So it's what we do. I do a lot of code switching, so based on the environment, you've got to be part of the environment. I said, "Oh, that's delightful," I said. Not knowing what other word to use. And she said, "So you would like a cup of tea?" And I said, "Oh, I'd be delighted with a cup of tea." I said, "This is all going really well." It's only the first stall I'd been to. And so, you know, these are people that have had inherited wealth. This is people that had, you know, their wealth from Elizabeth I and linked to the Warwick, and, you know, the House of Warwick and all this other kind of... So history is amazing. And she said, "Well, Madam, I've been tasked with making your cup of tea, and whilst I'm making your cup of tea, you should bring in those bugger of those boats and allow the buggers to drown," she said. And she said, "Would you like a spot of milk with that?" I said, "No, I'd prefer everything black, thank you very much." That's what you faced as a mayor. And it was, you knew that there's nobody else that's going to go through that. And then I heard somebody, and so as I'm sitting in the pew singing hallelujah at the highest voice, realizing that actually my days at school were the best spent days, and knowing all those, you know, those hymns, you know, and one of the ladies, she said, "Madam, we know you know hallelujah very loudly, but you do need to know the other words." And I said, "Yes, okay, fine." But there was a lady behind me, and she said, "Well, I didn't bloody vote for her as mayor. I'll be voting reform next time round. We don't want any more." And she was just sitting right there in front of me. And the brazenness of it. And I looked around, and she said, "Well, I wasn't talking about you." But this is the thing. It's so brazenly obvious now that people are willing to tell you to your face that they don't like you anymore, or that you are different, and therefore I don't like the colour of your skin. and that you look different. And it's not as subtle as it used to be, but it's more open. So you've got the institutional racism, which is the subtlety through the resumes and things like that. But then you've got now this open new willingness to be able to do what people do now, openly and brazenly. And having said that, we had 2 weeks ago, there's lots of stories, guys. So 2 weeks ago, I was knocking on, you all go door knocking, and so I went to door knocking, and I knew that this person at the end of this one street, somebody had dumped a sofa. So I knew that before I get to his house, I need to report that sofa, because he's going to tell me, have you reported the sofa? And so I knock his doorbell, his letterbox, I'm height challenged. So the doorbell it's either very high, and if you've got a bad back, it's either very low, and you kind of, one of the two. So I went for the doorbell, I went for the letterbox. And he came out storming. He said, do you know that there's a doorbell there? And I said, yes, I do know there's a doorbell there, but I'm height challenged and I couldn't really get up to it. And he said, yeah. He said, is that because you can't hear in your scarf? And I said, no, it's not that I can't hear in my scarf. I'm really short. I said, look, I've worn tiny shoes today and I just really can't get to the... And he said, do you know, he said to me, do you know I've just delivered reform leaflets in the next door to your... So I'm in Shirley South, in Shirley West. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, okay, do you want to talk about why you delivered leaflets? And he said, no, I don't want to be talking to you about this. And I said, well, I said, what are you having for lunch then? He said, I've just made myself a sandwich. I said, ham, is it? And he said, yes. He goes, and I know you don't like ham. And he said, therefore, I'm not going to offer it to you. And I said, that's fine. I don't want a ham sandwich anyway, because I'm not allowed it anyway. And he said, have you done anything about that sofa? And I said, yes, I have. Actually, I've just reported the sofa. And he said, well, whilst I'm posting leaflets and, reform leaflets there, I know you do a good job. You're different than the others. So again, you're door knocking, and this is the things that are coming up. Yeah, aggressive, but I kind of know that he still votes Green, because he wouldn't be on the knock list if he hadn't. That's how I see it, because when we did all the data, these are the people that do vote for you. But anyway, it was quite kind of funny.
It's very interesting, and it's interesting that visibility is one thing that can help get rid of these narratives of division that run through. And I think political leaders have emboldened people to be more in your face about these narratives. But is there anything we can do other than visibility, to fight these narratives of division within ourselves?
Should I kick off?
Yeah, you kick off.
Yeah. I mean, just to go back to the dehumanising thing, I suppose, to start with, I think that it's not natural for people. It's not natural for people to be vile, and so I think just being empathetic, just having that. I think part of what's trying to understand the Zach effect, whatever that was, is quite interesting. Because I don't think Zach has converted millions of people to green politics. I think those people were already looking for, were pissed off, knew that things were going wrong, knew that the Labour Party had sort of abandoned them, but also knew that the Labour Party wasn't standing up, wasn't providing any hope, wasn't providing any empathy, actually, was being mean-spirited. All that fiscal bloody nonsense is mean-spirited in the end. No, we can't do services, we can't do that, until we get growth, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of it. It's mean-spirited, and I think the fact that suddenly we were able to break through, for whatever reason, with something which was empathetic, was hopeful, was positive, is so important, and I think that's the key. But then you do have to then go through the various different narratives. So on housing, okay, so on housing, is it the case that the immigrants are taking all the housing? No, it's not. Social housing, actually the only people who get social housing nowadays, because there is so little of it and the waiting lists are so tight, is people who are desperate, who are basically homeless, and they're vulnerable, and they've got a local connection. You've got to have all of that, So most people are not getting social housing. Most, the vast majority who need social housing. And actually, if the estates have changed, it's probably because if there are ethnic minorities on the estate, often it will be nowadays because those houses were bought and then have ended up in the hands of landlords, and they're being rented back to people. And then so people are moving into those estates, but they're moving in to pay ridiculous rents. So we have to explain all that. You know, we do, unfortunately, but I think underneath that, there's a really good, I was listening to a podcast with Gary Stevenson, the economist, talking about housing. And underneath all that is wealth inequality. So because the super rich own so much of the wealth and are able therefore to just snap up each other's assets, the price of assets goes up, and that then affects the price of land, and it affects the availability of mortgages and all of that stuff. And so they're in control of all that, and it just gets tougher and tougher and tougher for everybody else. And actually, the most worrying bit about it was that he was sort of suggesting that the period where that wasn't the case, where that wealth inequality wasn't having that massive impact on making ordinary stuff impossible for most people, was actually quite a short period, you know, between the Second World War and the 70s. But nevertheless, that's what we've got to fight for again. So we can counter the narrative on racism around housing, and we've got to turn the fire on the very wealthy, and that's not, you know, okay, that's not very empathetic to the very wealthy, but sorry, there's a limit to empathy, you know, and I think that I think people do understand that massive wealth inequality is distorting everything. So I think, you know, and then if we think about, so that I'll try and be brief, but just thinking about, I mean, we could go through some other examples, and we're going to talk about one at the end anyway. But just in terms of community cohesion, I think the other part of it, the phrase which really cut through on Brexit, we have to acknowledge, was to take back control. And so that you know, and to go back to the beginning, the reason, you know, the dehumanisation is being weaponised because people feel out of control, people feel they have no say, people feel cynical, people think that the establishment just doesn't care, or is out to get them, or is taking the piss, or is ripping them off, whatever, you know. So all of that is there. So people do feel powerless. So part of it is also therefore about giving people a sense of say. And when we say people, that means all people. So then that suddenly means that people from different communities are going to find themselves in the same room discussing, you know, the plans for for some new housing, or the plans for traffic. And I mean, I just thinking about Shrewsbury now, you know, I think part of our narrative of fighting back against the far right is defending the movement plan, is saying, because we know actually that there is plenty of support for the idea that we shouldn't have so much traffic going through town. The right are trying to weaponise that, and they're trying to say that, oh, it's just a bunch of elite people who don't care about your journeys and are trying to make life difficult for you so that they can get on their fancy bicycles, you know. And so we have to fight back against that stuff as well, but do it in an empathetic way. I've skirted around a bit there.
No, I mean, for us, it's in Solihull, it's potholes and poo at the moment. That's what we're dealing with, and and again, I think it's again, when you're talking about inequalities, and I think for us is when you look outside somebody's house who have a really massive pothole and what you're going to do around it, it's about bringing that to I mean, that is actually part of your trade agreement from a United Kingdom side, because to be honest with you, we're not getting the cement back into the country because of the war that people have decided to fight. And so that is really interesting. During my mayoral year, we opened a elective hub, which is a surgery for the knee. And so we're getting through the very long waiting list to get people to get surgeries on their knees. Really did really well. I think there was £43 million investment in our local hospital. We have the first 2 new robots that are doing the work, which is amazing. Only to run out of cement that actually places the leg together, in that sense, the glue that is used as part of the cement that places things together in your knee. And I met a resident, and he said, Cllr Ashraf, he goes, thank you for opening the elective surgery. It had nothing to do with me. It was the money was coming in anyway. And he said, but you know, we've run out of cement, so I've got half my knee done. He goes, can you go to Germany and get the cement for the other half of the knee? And these are the things that actually, the decisions that governments make actually affect local people. And one example I will give you of health inequality is the Conservative government decided to invest in biomass boilers. Biomass boilers take pellets the only pellets that you can get for biomass boilers are from Ukraine. So then the Ukraine war happens, and we've got north and south, and most of the biomass boilers are in the high-rise social housing in the north of the borough. And the reason why we wanted biomass boilers in the north of the borough was so that the health inequalities come down, because if you put your heating on, you're less likely to get respiratory illness because some of the houses had mold. So it was all to counteract, good intentions and all that. In the end, they were paying more, twice as much per kilowatt hour than we were in the south. So in effect, when I went into the north of the borough, they were literally talking about, actually, Cllr Ashraf, I'm actually wondering whether I'm going to pay my token or whether I'm going to feed my kids today. So I've had to go down to the food bank, get extra beans for when my kids come home from school. And then women had to decide between buying sanitary pads or not buying sanitary pads. That's what we were facing, and that's the inequality in the north of the borough and the south of the borough. So around hate and division, what do you do when something happens like that? You're the first one that looks visibly different to be there, to be able to support, because actually that visibility does make a difference in that borough, in that part of the borough. And I think this is really, really important, because as we're talking about migrant communities and economic inequality, we're talking about businesses nationally like Lush, who are supporting things like Palestine, who are now supporting Together with Refugees campaign, which is amazing for us. And I think when we're looking at who can support us, it is businesses like that. It's small businesses that, sell the coffee shop, that get their beans ground from a very ethical source. Those are the kind of places that we see. When Southport riots happened, one of the things that we had was diaspora dialogues, in which we had a gentleman who was from the far right have a conversation with us as to why he behaved like that, and why. I mean, he's since, I'd like to say the word reformed, but I don't want to use it in that context. But yeah, he has since gotten better. But we had him in a conversation, and it was probably one of the toughest conversations of how much he hated people of colour. And that was to do, actually when you boiled it down to, it was boiled down to inequality. And the fact that his parents, when I spoke to him one-on-one, that his parents were on the housing ladder and couldn't get social housing in those days. So it ended up being boiled down to that issue. And the other thing, I think one of the things that we really, really need to think about is algorithms. The algorithms of social media. So when you click on something, we are an online nation. There is the Online Nation report that was produced in 2022, and we have to critically challenge misinformation. When we doom scroll, and I know we all do, when we're looking through Facebook or Instagram, and there's, it's not just the monkeys that are talking about their mothers and all the other kind of things. It is about, once you click on an algorithm that you think is about hate, that algorithm will actually recheck you, and then we'll restart posting this. So if you are already vulnerable and know that this is taking, you are more likely to be sucked into it. And I think one of the questions is how to get people sucked into this. And this is the kind of thing, actually, we have to critically challenge misinformation. If we do not, when we see something on Facebook, if we don't challenge it, you'll bet your bottom dollar nobody else will challenge it, and you'll probably be the only one. And then that, because it feeds off hate. So the algorithms get more hits or likes, and it feeds off that. And I think this is where division can be prevented, when we as humans see each other as humans, and we understand each other's experiences. We have access to truthful, empathetic stories. And I think this is about, and I would say my life in the 5 years that, you know, I've been elected as a councillor has been about all those stories where we've seen examples of hate. We've seen examples of people coming forward and really supporting us. We've seen, you know, people who've been in other spaces. You know, one of the biggest challenges, one of the other thing in the north of the borough, what we saw was there was a group called the Men's Sheds. And, you know, I was the only woman allowed into the men's shed. He said, oh, you're not like other women, you know, Councillor Ashraf. I said, oh, no, I've been told that on many fronts, but, you know, where do I fit in? And they said, it's because you actually listened to one of our stories on prostate cancer, and then you decided to do a fundraiser for prostate cancer, which is why we're allowing you into our men's sheds.
I think that's been such a big theme in both of your answers, that it's having these empathetic community leaders, empathetic ethical councillors who are willing to go and talk to people, willing to listen and give people a say in their neighbourhoods. When people have that power, they're less likely to feel divided. And so, you know, the work that you're doing is really bridging these gaps and helping with these.
It's hard though, Emma, because it really is hard, because, you know, you get doors shut on your face, you know, and that's really hard, and you're like, oh no, that's the 10th door. Hopefully the 11th one will be, you know, somebody will invite me, you know, in for a cup of tea, especially when it's raining. And one of the things I have noticed, if it's Aston Villa versus one of those football matches, don't bother knocking doors. It's really important that actually you also know about your football teams as well.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
Just one question left for me today. So we've talked a lot about divisions around identities, but parties like Reform UK are sort of pushing net stupid zero, and that these climate policies that are to protect our world are actually going to make ordinary people poorer, which feeds into this inequality narrative of theirs. But how would you counter this idea that net zero would make people poorer?
You go first, and then I'll go after.
Yeah, so,
because mine is a story.
So the first, I think. So there was a report came out a couple of days ago from the IPPR.
Is it IPCC?
No, not that one. IPPR. It was about attitudes. 60% of the population are still right behind net zero. 5% think that climate change is a myth. Okay, well, but probably 5% believe in fairies and all sorts of other stuff. So that's okay. 22% have bought into the idea that okay, there is climate change, but it's not human. It's something else. It's just happens. So we're still winning. You know, but the shocking thing is that the politicians don't recognise it. So the same study showed that, including Labour politicians, that when they were asked how many people supported net zero, they thought it was much lower than that. They thought they were losing the argument. They're not. You know, we're not losing the argument yet. But some of the argument around it is, you know, the division is coming in around, in particular, you can't do it, and the idea that it's just not achievable, is it? It's just not achievable, and I think that argument plays with the whole business of lack of trust, where all politicians are useless, they don't really care, they're in it for themselves. So all of that narrative obviously works when the right say we can't do it, and the other bit that sort of cuts through is, you know. What about the rest of the world? You know, there's no point in us doing it. But what wins against there's no point in us doing it because we're only 1% and it's all China. What wins against that, interestingly, is not going through the sort of maths and explaining the you know, sort of third sector, what do they call, scope 3 emissions and historical emissions. It's not all that. It is actually just getting down to the brass tacks of the emotion of it. It's saying, actually, you know, if everybody does that, then we are letting down future generations, you know, and that does cut through, and people go, okay, no, fair enough, no, we should all try. So we can still win those arguments, and we haven't lost it. And then it's about the actual measures. So and I think I fell into a trap over a couple of years. I remember saying, you know, we can do climate action without talking about the climate, and you can. Because you can insulate people's homes, you can bring down people's bills, you can introduce renewable energy, which will give us proper energy security as well as cheaper energy. You can introduce, you know, public transport, which is both decarbonising but also good for social justice. So you can do all that without mentioning the climate, but there's no reason not to mention the climate, because it turns out that actually people do care, and it does motivate people. And especially if we're talking about behaviour change, people need motivation. Because whilst the behaviour changes are going to result in something better, it's still change. And so people do need a motivation. So I think that I had slipped into the idea that we, don't talk about the climate, just get on with the measures. But actually, no, it's worth doing both. People still get it. So I think we can still win. And it just brings me back to the Shrewsbury Moves thing. I think that we have to get on the front foot. If people don't know, Shrewsbury Moves is a scheme to create loops in the town. So you can't drive through, you can drive to. Emergency vehicles can drive through. You can walk through, you can cycle through, buses can go through, but it will take private cars out of going through. And it could be tweaked. It could be that it becomes a daytime scheme, but you can go through at night time. There's all sorts of possibilities, so it's up for grabs. Reform are going for it, saying, and they've got an excuse, the terrible gyratory scheme. They're saying, well, that's what they're on about. That's Shrewsbury Moved. You can't trust them with any of this. We should just allow people to drive wherever they want. Full stop. So that's the reform approach. Labour have caved in. So Labour brought a motion to the Town Council last week saying, we need to think again. Too many people are against it. There isn't the evidence. There isn't the evidence. When the consultation was actually taking place, the support was really good. So now we need to trial it. And yes, there'll be periods where it's going to get tough. It's going to get a little bit hairy. But, I think we need to be brave, and we need to take communities with us and talk to them. And so I think that's the way we're going to have to do all sorts of climate action. We're going to have to be brave about it, based on the fact that we still know that most people care. And then, based on that bravery, you then also take people on the journey, you get them involved, you tweak it, you change the measures as you're going along. A lot of the stuff which is about behaviour change, you've got to involve people in it. And it's not easy, but there is no choice. And at the same time, can build cohesion, can build communities coming together to make their places better.
Yeah, so for me, net zero isn't about taking away from people, as you said, Julian. It's about investing in the lives of ordinary people. And for far too long, ordinary people have been told lies about what net zero is. And this is about securing something that is for the health and betterment and sustainability, not just for now, for future generations. And that's what net zero is. And I'll give you an example. I learn a lot of when I door knock, and it's also about how do you talk to people who have no idea of net zero on the doorstep? We know you're green, and we know that you're environmental, and that we know that you do everything that is around climate change. But explain to me what net zero is. In fact, you have to do it in language that people understand. And so for me, it was about, this is one example I gave, and this is something that I worked on within the borough. So I'm the opposition spokesperson on health and social care. And so my thing was around young people with asthma and air quality. And I was saying, one of the women, I said, you know what it is, Helen? You told me that your son's got asthma. And she said, yeah. And I said, you happen to be living in the corridor that has the most emissions, PM 2.5 level here, PM 10.5 level there, which means that actually this corridor itself is full of emissions, right? And I said, and she said, yeah, Shahin, I spoke to you last time, and, my son went into hospital because of his asthma. And I said, yeah. And I said, listen, part of it is that the children who are living in this side of the, this is how I had to bring it to the council as well. A lot of children who are living in this side of the road are more likely to suffer higher rates of asthma, right? And other respiratory illnesses because they're due to the poor air quality on this side of the road. In fact, on this side of the borough, because the motorway is there, then you've got these large emissions, and then you've got this big cloud from the industrial work. And we just to say that we do love Birmingham, but we just say the cloud's coming over from Birmingham. But anyway, so there's this cloud coming over, and we talk about how families who are between the ages of 12 to 15 in this particular road have higher levels of asthma, who are out of school as a result of asthma, who then are likely to miss a load of work at school, which means that they're not, and we've done this study on that, who are more likely to feel squeezed out from the narratives of ordinary understanding of what does this net zero mean. So in the end, if you don't do anything about net zero will make you poorer if you don't actually understand the whole science behind it. And I know that parties like Reform are kind of exploiting that resentment, but if the policies of net zero are for long-term gains, actually. And so net zero is an opportunity that I've said to her, and I said is to reduce the long-term costs of what your son will have to go through, and improve jobs within this area as well, and improve the environment on top of that. And then you're improving the health and well-being of all these young people who are unable to go to school because of the issues with asthma, and actually create jobs. And you know, it's a false economy when people are told that actually net zero will cost you in the long term, when actually, in actuality, for the long term, this is the only kind of sustainable solution that we will have. And not only that, net zero will bring down look, right now, if you have a look at, yesterday I put petrol into the car. I have a hybrid, but it's a petrol hybrid. Just the crisis itself has hit us so hard. What I normally used to put in is £53.79, to the point. But yesterday I had to put in £79. That's just because of the war in Iran, sorry. Protested a lot on Iraq, but that's the whole thing about Iran. And you're not having to, and if you do the net zero, you're not having to rely on other governments. You're actually pulling in the source yourself, source of those energy resources that we want. And that's the thing, that the claim that net zero is going to make ordinary people poorer, that's just a fallacy in that sense. And you know, you're targeting equitable policies around this. You've got enough evidence to support this. You know, low asthma and respiratory illnesses, especially in deprived areas, reduces the illness. That was a Public Health in England report. The economic benefits of reduced energy costs as a result of going net zero as well. And the cleaner air improves concentrated school attendance, and that was a UK government air quality report on net zero. And these are the kind of things that we have to push, because you can't tell ordinary people net zero and this is all about the environment and you do the technical data. No. What does it mean for me? It means actually your child can go to school as a result, if we can just figure out how to do this on this, and people can campaign with you, and that's how. And in fact, that's actually how, on the net zero target on asthma, is how we managed to get about 15 extra volunteers for the Green Party as a result of that in the north of the borough. And I think this is it. It's that twofold responsibility that actually you want to be able to save this planet and this environment, not just for you, but for your grandchildren and for future generations. Yeah.
At this point, we can open up to some questions from the floor if anybody has some questions.
Do we have a chance to say something?
Pardon?
Do we have a chance to say something?
Keep statements short, but then make sure there's a question at the end. So thank you.
You stand up to racism, and you probably, well, anyway, next Saturday there's going to be a mass in London demonstration, not on the day, against Tommy Robinson and before. It's a coming together of at least 80 organisations which said we cannot allow these organisations to go and take the streets. The last time, Tommy Robinson got 250,000 people on the streets of London. That gives confidence to people to put up all those flags.
Yeah.
Now, it is important to talk about the everyday issues, but unless we stop the growth of the far right, we've got major problems. Farage seriously is talking about, if he gets into power, even on a council, he will train up and recruit young people to go into a British vision of what ICE has done in America. So, yes, it's not about turning up and shouting at each other on a corner. It's getting all those people together. Organisations who normally play soft and conservative a bit, Friends of the Earth, etc., are saying we have to together show that is what this country is about. It's not the far right. So, if you haven't booked on the coaches of the next Saturday, do. But at the same time, locally, we need to get all these organisations quite a few are there, you know, refugee organisations and what have you in Shropshire.
Absolutely.
The last time they tried to turn up in Shrewsbury, 500 people was in the square against half a dozen. Brilliant. But let's not get too thick with it. Robinson has come to Telford twice. He's hinted he's going to do it again. We have to get not hundreds of people, thousands there. Not over fight on the street to say, we come together and this is us. So if you're not careful, we just talk about, yes, we want the schools to improve. We want those flipping holes filled in properly on this road. But at the same time, we've got to stop these people from becoming stronger.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, they are at the moment. We're coming together as can and should stop that. So, join Shropshire Stand Up as racism, the trade unions to support it, the refugee, and we support them. So,
Thank you.
And it is about hope, isn't it? It's about hope in being united and coming together to be able to say, actually, you won't divide Britain because Britain is one group of people that doesn't agree with what he's saying. And we've seen, look, I lived in America for 8 years. I've seen what happens, hate from a hate perspective, what can actually happen in places like Bosnia, and what happens in places like the United States. Having lived there, it is, and having friends there at the moment who are going through such a hard time at this moment in time. And it's not a healthy country to be in, but we certainly do not want anything like that within the United Kingdom, and I think that's really important.
Green infrastructure on involved.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. We have some other time for some other questions.
Thank
You can talk at the end. Thank you. Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, I'm interested to know what opportunities you see that there are for building bridges actually between people who may be vulnerable to being sucked into ideas about like what ways can we open conversations and build relationships and visibility and give them a different reason, a different path perhaps towards hope instead of.
So when the far right, so in Solihull we have a hotel that houses refugees, and we had the far right protest right outside the hotel. And I had gone out and tried to speak to some of the people. Obviously I had to be on one, because there was people on one side of the road and the other ones on the other side of the road. And one of the ladies, she'd kind of straddled off, and she said, "Oh, you know, I need to get into Touchwood, which is a local shopping centre." And she was, and I just happened to be walking behind her because I needed to get a sandwich. I happened to be behind her, and she's like, "You know, I'm never gonna." She said, "I don't know why I'm in front of the hotel. I know Dave told me to come in here and protest and he gave me the flag, and that's what I did." And she said, "But that's never going to get my daughter her EHCP plan, is it?" And so I actually ran in front of her and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I overheard you speaking." And she said, "Oh, are you that counsellor?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "You know, I can help you with your EHCP plan." And probably 6 weeks into it, helped her with the EHCP plan, and she said, "Oh, you're not like the others, are you?" But the point was, it's about coming at people. She struggled with the plan, and the reason why she struggled with the plan was those EHCP plans are like a 40 to 60 page document that you have to prove X, Y, and Z. She was neurodiverse herself, and so therefore wasn't able to read the form properly, then struggled to read the form, then got into this group of people who said it's because everybody else is taking the EHCP plans. And there was a group of mums there who were there on the far right side because of that situation, because somebody had sold them a lie about EHCP plan. In the end, I took all their cases, even though they were not my constituents, and managed to get, it took me about 11 weeks, but managed to get most of them in their EHCP plans. But I think this is the kind of thing, isn't it, where you kind of, and I'm not saying it'll be the same for everyone, And there will be people who are divisive, who do genuinely hate people. Nick, who is our reverend in the church at St. Alfred, in which they were outside, some of them wanted to join the church because they said, look, we want to be the far-right Christian group that's in this church. Nick is having to deal with how do you get these far-right people who now want to suddenly become Christian, that want to be in an environment in which he has regular migrant coffee mornings with. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done, and part of that is having those relationships. And if we can all do a bit of that, I think it really would help.
I mean, I think it's a really tough ask, isn't it? Because I'm just thinking about, for us in Shrewsbury, you know, where are the places, where are the situations where you can engage in those discussions, and you know, where are they? I don't know. There are not many of them, but and so you end up just taking it online, and that's probably the worst place to try and engage, you know. But the fact that Up Sewage Creek are going to be marching through town tomorrow and calling out the shit in the river and saying it's not good enough and we need to nationalise. Actually, there are plenty of reform curious voters in Shrewsbury who go, yeah, good on you for doing that. And that is reaching out. So I think it is about, you know, just taking any opportunity we can where there is common ground to make a load of noise, rather than, you know, trying to seek somebody out and say, right, I want to argue with you about immigration. Actually, let's start with the stuff that we have in common, and let's see if we can find some common ground, and then that opens up the conversation.
I think as council as well, funding community spaces where people can actually meet in person and talk and see the people in their neighbourhood, and like football for kids where they're meeting kids from other places and they're not just online. Those are all things that are at our local level helping with that kind of narrative as well.
And Emma, there is more in common than that what divides us, to be honest. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
If you sit down with someone, you're more likely to have a conversation with them on everything that is common.
Yeah.
And then they're kind of like, oh, you're interesting. And then suddenly it's suddenly I'm just talking to a normal person. Exactly.
Built up in their head. And you're
exactly.
Yeah.
I'm one of the Labour members that defected to Green.
Yeah.
And I was Shrewsbury's mayor after Julian, and I was a town councillor for Harlescote, which is one of our most deprived areas. And I found that joining in activities such as we're coming up to shows and things that happen within the communities, is going there and talking to that local community, offering to do things like, as you have done, you know, and taking on board, doing lots, being seen out there and litter picking. And during my time as mayor, we had the Live Hotel, which had our asylum seekers in there, and some of their stories were heartbreaking. You know, I was on a Zoom call with one of the young men, to his wife, who was hidden in a bunker in Afghanistan, and he'd come over in some precarious way to try and get her entry, and to then transfer that information to the residents around Harlescote to say, actually, they're desperate, they're human beings, you know, and we need to be respecting that. So I think the more we're out within the communities, supporting every part of the community. I come from the neurodiverse community, and I support many, along with being ADHD myself. And if you don't talk about it, if you don't make it common communication, they can then, you know, create the three-headed, you know, people. So I think we as a community can do what they did in America, which was when we saw the Buddhist monks walk from one end to the other, and actually some of the people that had voted Trump were in tears as they witnessed these monks peacefully walking past. And I think if we as these peaceful members connect together and create a voice that says, you know, your narrative is wrong, and we need to be kind and caring and without hating each other, I think that's the way that we move forward.
And even things like in other parts of the ward in Solihull, you know, you've got all these crochet clubs. Oh, it's terrible. But, you know, you're like, no, this is meant to be a flower, Cllr Ashraf. Okay, but the point is, you know, just going into those clubs, or just sitting around luncheon clubs in the evening or in the afternoon. Parkinson's, that was one of the things I used to go and support them in the Parkinson's with their I mean, they did more exercise than I did in the end eventually. But, you know, the point was just being there for people who are struggling, who are seeing that actually suddenly, all of a sudden, somebody's got diagnosed with Parkinson's, and the person who then suddenly ends up becoming a carer later on in life. You know, those are real struggles. And people do look to blame. We all do that. We're like, well, you know, if she hadn't done that, I wouldn't have been in this position. I mean, that kind of thing. And we all do it. But what can we do from genuine empathy to be able to support our communities? It is the little things like litter picking. It is the things around being part of those clubs. It's about supporting men, women, transgender, you know, minority communities. But I think as long as we've got a heart to do that and are empathetic to do that, we do have to give some of our time. And if we can do that, that'll probably be one of the most beneficial things that you come away with, because you come away with so many beautiful lessons, you know, so many beautiful lessons. And suddenly you realize actually that walking club that's been walking for 20 years no longer has funding from the council to do that walking. But you realized that walking club is actually the only mental health well-being walking club we had. We had a walking club in Solihull that walked through Solihull Town Centre. It was a men's walking club. It had been for men who had lost their jobs recently. And that goes on every week on a Tuesday and a Thursday in Solihull. But one of the men had committed suicide because he had heard that these clubs were going to close down. So it is about being there for our communities. If we're not there for our communities, and we allow for the other people to come in to fill those gaps, that noise of other people is going to be louder. And we know that good people need to be in that space.
Very quick. So, I mean, I think, for example, I think the work you did to help bring the Kynaston Community Centre back to life was terrific, really, really important for that community. So, you know, thank you for that work. And I think that, I mean, my year as mayor was coming out of COVID. It was a bit quiet, but I think that connected us, and you've told those stories. So Emma, who's one of our town councillors, will have an opportunity at some stage perhaps to step up and be a mayor. So I think it's you know, I mean, there's aspects of it which are, you know, frankly ridiculous and embarrassing, but there are also aspects of it which does give you that connection, those chances to talk to people you would never get a chance to talk to. So it's a very interesting role, actually.
We probably have time for one more quick question from the audience before we finish for today. Thank you.
I'm going to be cheeky and not make a question. I'm going to make a statement. I'm from the regional party. This brilliant woman is up for election in 6 weeks. Reform would like to take her out. There's a good train connection between here and Solihull. Please, if you've got free time.
To join the Greens, not Reform, that is. Just saying.
Between now and then, weekdays or the weekends, there is stuff going on, and she and her colleagues would be very grateful for your help and so would we.
It was that was part of the deal for Shane coming today, that we promised that we'll organise at least a carload to go out and help in Solihull. Yeah, absolutely.
And they're wonderful people in Solihull. Yeah. Occasionally get it wrong, but they're lovely people.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for coming and speaking to us today. Just final housekeeping before we go. Today was a free event, but we have got the opportunity to donate some money to a local party. We will use it for going to Solihull to go and support Cllr Ashraf's campaign in May, and we will use it for printing more lovely leaflets and encouraging people to join and letting them know that we are here and we're hopeful and we're trying to make Shrewsbury a place where everyone can exist in solidarity with each other. So thank you very much for coming today. And if you want to talk to us again, we'll be around the back.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.